My name is Dr. Susan Papp. This paper was originally presented at a conference entitled European Conflicted Heritage, New Reflections on the Treaty of Trianon 100 Years in Perspective. The conference was held at the Monk School of Global Affairs and Public Policy at the University of Toronto in October of 2020. My presentation, entitled Collective Memory Through the Lens of Minority Communities, will describe the results of an essay competition submitted by students who live in minority status in 4 countries surrounding Hungary. These countries include Romania, Slovakia, Ukraine, and Serbia. I will focus my presentation on the human cost of the treaty, an impact that is still felt today, fully 3 generations later. The essays were submitted through an online competition posted by the Canadian Rákóczi Foundation this past May. The title of the call for essays was simply the question, "What does Trianon mean to you today?" The response was overwhelming. Within a brief span of 30 days, there were almost 100 essays and 5 short films submitted from students and young professionals who have lived for most or all of their developmental years as minorities in the above-mentioned countries. Some respondents are still in university, while others have already completed their degrees and are building their careers. Others live in the country of their birth. Others have left in search of educational and career opportunities in the European Union. For the past 26 years, this Canadian foundation has sponsored a program called Students Without Boundaries for students living in minority status in East Central Europe. The program was founded just as borders were reopening following the collapse of communism. The organizers believed that these minorities were forgotten minorities of Europe. The topic fell into a category of historical memory that post-war, both in East and West, European nations willingly submerged into the freezer of history. Since the collapse of the Soviet Union and other significant geopolitical changes that have unfolded in Europe since 1989, a much debated revival of memory has occurred. Until the early 1990s, these young people rarely had an opportunity to travel outside their homelands, outside their towns and villages, let alone outside their country of birth. The motivation behind the founding of the program was that the organizers believed that they could make a difference in bringing Canadian ideals of multiculturalism and tolerance to a region of East Central Europe so frequently shattered by ethnic divisions and misinformation. It became an educational exchange program as more Canadian students took part and learned about the everyday lives of these minorities. For the past 26 years, more than 3,500 students from Slovakia, Romania, Ukraine, Serbia, Canada, and the United States have taken part in this international student educational exchange program. The targeted age group, 14 through 18, is seen as the most sensitive period in the formation of one's identity and self-esteem. Culturally specific ways of gender identity are among the first that most people encounter, along with ethnic identity. Identity negotiation is a dynamic process. Culturally specific assumptions contained within a diverse range of interrelated practices, such as language, religion, sexuality, among others, means that a person's identity is always a conglomerate of many identities. This is especially true for young people living in minority status, as they face the challenges of being accepted in both minority community as well as in the majority community. It is a feature of belonging to a minority community to try to understand others, as well as oneself, who one is, where one belongs. A healthy self-identity is important to lead a stable, well-balanced life, and Students Without Boundaries assist students in finding their places in the world. There is no need to explain ethnic identity to participants. This is already an integral part of their lives. There is a need, however, to encourage them to be able to accept this part of their identity and at the same time to be open to understanding other cultures. Students Without Boundaries provides a framework for self-exploration within the context of their own reality. As the program widens the horizons of these young people following the program, the majority of these participants are later propelled into careers they would have otherwise not even contemplated. They learn about scholarships, bursaries, and other education programs such as the Erasmus program for university students within the European Union. As a historian and filmmaker, I've always been interested in the frequently studied sociological term, quote, transgenerational transmission of trauma, end quote. That is the passing down of traumatic events from one generation to another. I dealt with this topic extensively in my first independently directed film, Debris of War, about the trauma faced by Bosnian refugees having to flee for their lives in the former war-torn Yugoslavia. In 2008, this Canadian initiative was awarded the first Charlemagne Youth Prize by the European Parliament for promoting tolerance and integration and creating a long-term network of support for these minorities. As this year's program was postponed because of the pandemic, the foundation put out the aforementioned call for essays about the 100th anniversary to see how this generation of young people who have lived in minority status in these countries for 3 generations perceive the treaty that changed the lives of their families so dramatically 100 years ago. That's the background. Now I will present 3 main themes that were the most frequently examined by these young writers, these fresh voices. The first theme presented in these essays is the feeling of being marginalized, of still being discriminated against because of who these students are, even after the passage of 100 years. There is a common complaint of ongoing violation of linguistic rights, especially in Romania and lately in Ukraine. Many express sadness when bilingual signs on the town halls of their communities were defaced or removed completely and replaced by Romanian-only signs. In addition to the upsetting factor frequently mentioned in these essays is what happens to signage in 2 languages, especially in communities where Hungarian residents still comprise more than 80% of the population. Students write with incredulity, quote, why are bilingual signs with the name of the town in Romanian and Hungarian that are put into place one day, defaced and vandalized with spray paint by the next morning, end quote. Many students wrote about the feeling of being scapegoated and about widespread name-calling. Several of the essayists describe how distressing and frequent the name-calling is. In Romania, Hungarians are called Bocskor, a derogatory word for homeless individuals. Repeatedly in the essays, students living in Romania related painful incidents of being berated on the streets or in public places for speaking in their mother tongue, being ejected from taxis, chased off buses, and even assaulted. But the real question so many of them ask is, quote, how much longer? And, quote, to what end, end quote. Human rights reports conclude that, quote, a large-scale promotion of tolerance and multilingualism is required in Romania, end quote. Kay Varga from Romania summarizes these points in her own words, quote, we grew up on a mixture of 2 or more cultures. As we make our way along the streets in our communities, we meet with street names in more than one language, but not necessarily ours. It is not at all clear when we go to the bakery whether we should ask for bread in Hungarian and not be served, or if we meet a dear friend on the street, whether we should greet him or her in our mother tongue so that the friend will not suffer consequences because of that greeting. We suffer discrimination and marginalization where we live, and we don't quite fit in anywhere. End quote. Unfortunately, they write that this behavior is condoned and encouraged by the political leadership of the country. According to recent human rights reports, official government websites, most recently even health-related reports, say that even reports and posters and information on COVID were printed only in Romanian. The students expressed their outrage that governments are building these discriminatory language laws into their political agendas. In Ukraine, essayists write that hate speech and phobia are on the rise, and that some political leaders, rather than condemn such expressions, are often part of the incitement. Hungarian students have recently been called debil, meaning retarded, because they have a hard time learning the Ukrainian language. As a historian, it is alarming to think of the effects of such scapegoating and name-calling. Recent genocides, such as Rwanda and Bosnia, have demonstrated that name-calling is the first step towards marginalizing a group from mainstream society. In effect, it leads to demonization of the ethnic group from being outsiders to being aliens. S. Genoveva writes, quote, Ukraine is struggling to fit into the European Union, but in every practicality, this is just not working. The government is bringing in legislation that is making it impossible for minorities to survive. They are taking away our basic human rights as they prevent us from using our mother tongue in schools, workplaces, and all. Members of the EU say that this goes against all EU laws, but still the government persists. Several historians among the essayists even noted that Ukrainians suffered such language restrictions when they were under Soviet rule, and how ironic it is that Ukraine is now enacting similar prohibitive language laws upon their own minorities. The second major theme that drew the focus of many students is that of waiting, still waiting after 100 years for educational and career opportunities, and the inability to become part of the mainstream society in which they live. Many of those who submitted essay questions why they remain stranded on the periphery of the countries ask why that is, why they are stranded on the periphery of the countries where they were born. Following the brutal war of the breakup of the former Yugoslavia, Serbia is attempting to create an environment that is more amenable to minorities living within it, with the hope of better relations with neighbors will strengthen its economy and eventually lead to joining the European Union. Essayist M. Vivian summarizes this concept and praises Serbia's recent attempts at inclusiveness, including establishing cultural autonomy for Vojvodina. He writes, quote, when, after 100 years, will our rights be respected as founding people of the countries we live in? Serbia has, thus far, been the only country in the region that in 2003 recognized the collective rights of the Hungarian minority, a concept that was far advanced of the other neighboring countries, end quote. There are some hopeful signs elsewhere as well. In Slovakia, some of the essayists noted that the recently elected prime minister of the new centrist government, Igor Matović, has expressed his intent to examine the problematic issues between Hungarians and Slovaks. Recently, Matović has made a promise of providing funding for Hajdók, the cultural organization representing Hungarians in the country. Moreover, the restrictive language law brought in by Slovakia in 2009 was rescinded 2 years later, the Slovak government realizing the damage it was doing to the country's international reputation. Several of the essays pointed out, however, that the Beneš decrees are still legal in Slovakia. These are laws that allow the official expulsion of minorities and expropriation of their land and property. The Beneš decrees have never been revoked and understandably are still a cause for concern for the minority communities. The third critical theme emphasized by these students was the desire to have the opportunity to build a better future. In order to do so, they expressed a need to learn more about history, about tragedies, as well as the glories in order to better understand their past. Some essayists were more realistic about the political situation in the homeland than others, but none of the 93 expressed revisionist views or were bitter about their fate. Most were positive in their outlook regarding their future, despite the problematic and difficult historical memories of the past 100 years. The essayists expressed a responsibility to work harder, efficient, to learn more languages. They expressed their hopes and dreams for more inclusivity, language rights, and autonomy in cultural fields. The narrative also included incorporating the lessons of Trianon into their lives, not mourning the past, but by building on it. Education and opportunities in the country where they were born, they conclude, would be an important first step. G. Svingola, quote, Trianon, even after 3 generations, has made us, Hungarians of Transcarpathia, who we are today, able to tolerate all, able to survive all, able to know great joy and tremendous sorrow. We appreciate so much because so much has been taken away from us. We will stay and persevere no matter what the government and our politicians plot against us. End quote. Many of these young people expressed how through the stroke of a pen, their lives and the lives of their forefathers and mothers were changed irrevocably. They also expressed how they have had to work and are willing to work that much harder to achieve their goals. There was a strong attachment to the land of their ancestors. To conclude, I want to share with you the sentiments of the first prize winner, J. Barotti from Romania, who sums up the hopes and aspirations that only a young person could bring to such an issue. Quote, I have the right to live a full life without discrimination in the region that my ancestors fought and died for, to enjoy the rich cultural roots they handed down to me through generations and the natural world they preserved. Our goal is not border revision. Rather, as laid out by the European Union, to live in a borderless society and to develop the economic, community, and cultural ties with like-minded communities to belong to the circulatory path of the European Union. I believe there is hope to live in a better world. I believe it is possible to take action that for young people growing up now, not only be a bitter history lesson, but rather it be a tie to the past and offer a better understanding of the present and the future, that this historical event should provide the wisdom to create a better home for us all. End quote. Thank you for your kind attention. I hope this summary of the thoughts and feelings of these young people will deepen the understanding of the long-term repercussions of the treaty 100 years later. My name is Dr. Zsuzsa Papp, and this roundtable discussion was originally presented at a conference entitled Heritage, New Reflections on the Treaty of Trianon, 100 Years in Perspective. The conference was held at the Munk School of Global Affairs and Public Policy at the University of Toronto on October 15th, 2020. I am very pleased to introduce 4 young professionals who have lived for most or all of their developmental years as minorities in Slovakia, Ukraine, Romania, and Serbia. They will provide firsthand accounts of how their lives in minority status unfolded in these regions. They are all deeply concerned with the human rights situation in their homeland and will share with us their experiences. We will hear rare insights into these regions through the knowledge of our presenters. Agota-Dorottya was born and raised in Transylvania, Romania. She obtained a master's degree at Babes-Bolyai University, Cluj-Napoca, Kolozsvár, in regional development. Soon after, she became advisor to King Gagal, member of the European Parliament. Since 2014, serves as secretary of the Intergroup for Traditional Minorities, National Communities and Languages, the only official forum on the level of the European Union where matters related to national and linguistic minorities can be presented and discussed. Her presentation, The Hungarian Minority Community Living in Transylvania, Case Studies of the Minority Intergroup of the European Union. Welcome.
Thank you very much. Ladies and gentlemen, it's an honor to be invited to speak to you today. I was born and raised in Transylvania, Romania, where the Hungarian community counts 1.2 million people, according to the census in 2011. For 10 years now, I have been working in Brussels as advisor on minority rights. At the end of the First World War, as the consequence of the peace agreement of the Treaty of Trianon, Hungary lost more than 2/3 of its territory, thus becoming a landlocked state surrounded entirely by its former territory. Although the Treaty of Trianon and the other peace treaties ending the First World War are 100 years behind us, in certain regions, these stir feelings even nowadays and give base for concerns and indignation that is misused by politics. The EU membership of Hungary and its neighboring countries has brought about positive changes in many respects, but no comprehensive solution has been achieved for the protection of national minorities, and it did not automatically guarantee the immediate solution for the problems of the Hungarian communities living outside of Hungary's borders. The situation of Hungarian communities has its ups and downs, largely depending on daily political developments in the given capitals. During recent years, we have witnessed several serious cases where even previously acquired rights have been breached contrary to EU values and accession criteria. For example, churches and individuals still struggle on paper and in practice to claim back their nationalized properties, such as historical schools or historical libraries. Let me give you an eloquent example on how vivid the 100-year-old history can be in our days. Last year, an Austro-Hungarian military cemetery from the First World War, located in a predominantly Hungarian-inhabited region of Transylvania, Romania, became the center of attention in minority-majority relations. The graveyard in question was founded by Hungarians in 1917. It was taken care by the local Hungarian community ever since and was left intact for the past 100 years. Now, in 2019, further to the decision of the town council of the neighboring Romanian majority small town, a Romanian war monument and war graves were erected inside the cemetery. This caused indignation and civic protest by the local Hungarian population because probably no Romanian soldiers were buried on this site. The protest led to violent conflicts between the Romanian and the Hungarian communities. The local Hungarian minority claims that their right to the war cemetery should be protected. The new statues and national flags should be removed, as war cemeteries are protected by international and bilateral agreements. Therefore, it is the duty of the Romanian state to protect this monument, even if it is a memorial site of the Hungarian minority. The case is not resolved. Heated tensions are still ongoing between the local minority and majority population, community and the Romanian government, as well as between the governments of Hungary and Romania. During this protest, a group of Romanians repeatedly shouted, "Expel the Hungarians from the country." Hungarian and Romanian NGOs together brought the case to the court as a clear manifestation of discrimination against Hungarians. Despite all efforts, the local prosecutor ruled the claim was unfounded, stating that, I quote, "The statements did not target a whole community and were not addressed to a defined group of minority, such as disabled people or sexual minorities," end of quote. The Hungarian delegation of the European People's Party in the European Parliament tabled a written question to the European Commission. We asked whether the Commission deemed the case discriminatory according to the Article 2 of the Treaty on the European Union, that enshrines the respect of the rights of minorities, non-discrimination and equality. It was just a few weeks ago that we received the official answer that is rather evasive and sheds light on the double standards that are in place when it comes to the protection and non-discrimination of the different minority groups. In matters and concerns of traditional, national and linguistic minorities, the European Commission would always state that these matters should be dealt with on national level according to the principle of subsidiarity. Meanwhile, when it comes to the other cases of discrimination, it would speak out openly, disregarding the principle of subsidiarity. And I would like to also add that during last weekend's national elections, it's been formed a party from this group of Romanians who shouted they expel the Hungarians from Romania, and now they are in the Romanian parliament. Despite the aspirations, there is no uniform, coherent minority protection at the EU level. This is why it is necessary to keep the question of traditional, national, and linguistic minority communities on the agenda of the EU institutions. One of the few EU-wide forums that deals with this issue is the Intergroup for Traditional Minorities, National Communities, and Languages of the European Parliament that I serve as secretary of since 2014. The aim of this intergroup is achieving an enhanced political presence in the European Parliament on one hand, and having an impact on the overall European policy making regarding minority issues on the other. Such bodies of the European Parliament need to be re-established at the beginning of each parliamentary term. In 2014, 65 members of the Parliament, representing 21 member states from various political groups, joined the initiative. Ms. Bocskor, who's going to speak after me, is also a very active member of this intergroup. During the parliamentary mandate of 2014-2019, there were a total of 35 meetings held, becoming one of the most active intergroups in the parliament. During these sessions, representatives of national and linguistic minority communities from all over Europe had the opportunity to present their problems and challenges, but also to share the best practices that could be implemented elsewhere. Besides the concrete case studies, various international organizations were present and thematic discussions were also organized. The management of this minority intergroup takes a lot of effort, but as a result, we managed to put on the agenda a case concerning a Hungarian minority community almost every third session. Firstly, I would like to stress the importance of the fact that during such meetings, the main leaders of the Hungarian communities concerned had the opportunity to speak directly to members of the European Parliament. This presentation local media of the minorities, giving credibility and support to their local representatives. In the same time, the European politicians receive first-hand information from the most credible and authentic sources. I will focus now on those matters that were discussed concerning the Hungarian minority in Transylvania. Mr. Hunor Kelemen, president of the Democratic Alliance of Hungarians in Romania, was participating twice on the meetings, presenting the current situation of the Hungarian community in Romania. As he said, during 2.5 decades of struggles based on democratic tools, cooperation and dialogue between minority and majority, important pieces of legislation protecting minorities were adopted in Romania. However, minority protection still lacks solid constitutional provisions. The state does not provide sufficient legal and institutional guarantees, and the application of the existing legislation remains partial. Furthermore, the right to use community symbols has been questioned, and the investigation restitution process to the historical church properties was initiated. It's very important that the RMDS got again in the Romanian parliament so that they can keep continuing representing our interests. The question of restitution of properties was discussed on several occasions in the intergroup. Falling behind the Iron Curtain, East Central Europe ended up in a geopolitical position that suffered greatly from the cruelty of the communist regimes. Let it be majority, and even more in the case of minority communities, these societies were deprived of civil rights and of their private properties. Church properties, community-owned and private properties were taken through the process of nationalization. Such processes caused harm to the very survival of the minority communities. After the fall of communism, the process of restitution started, but many cases are still problematic or unsolved up to this day. Private properties that are already in very bad condition easily fall prey to the everlasting judicial processes. Furthermore, in the case of several schools, the very existence of the educational institutions concerned are due to problems related to the ownership of the buildings they operate in. Another recurring topic was the access to mother tongue education and educational rights. To learn the minority language and to be instructed in a minority language on all educational levels. These constitute the key problems for minorities in the region in general, and these rights are those which states are less generous to promote. As a concrete example, the situation of the University of Medicine of Marosvásárhely, Târgu-Mureș, was presented in detail. This university, providing medical education, has existed for the past 7 decades. Back in the 1970s, in the context of this university, the Romanian Communist Party established the Romanian Language Department, clearly reflecting state-led assimilation efforts directed against the minority Hungarian community. After the 1990s, disregarding demands of the Hungarian community to reinforce education in their mother tongue, the authorities rejected their demands. Moreover, in 2018, the Romanian majority of the university's Senate decided to merge the University of Medicine with another university. Then they announced that they would launch an English language department and completely terminate education in Hungarian. This the demands of the Hungarian community for the past 30 years, an issue that remains unresolved to this day. Representatives of the Steklar National Council were also present to introduce the European Citizens Initiative entitled Cohesion Policy for the Equality of the Regions and the Sustainability of the Regional Cultures that is still ongoing. The aim of the initiative is for the cohesion policy of the European Union to grant special attention to regions with national, ethnic, cultural, religious, or linguistic characteristics that are different from those of the surrounding regions. Besides the problems and challenges that the minority communities are facing, we are also trying to shed light on the best practices or good examples. In this regard, I would like to mention a presentation about the European Youth Capital 2015 project. This project gave the youth of Cluj-Napoca, Kolozsvár, Klausenburg the opportunity to find a youth-friendly, fresh and dynamic approach to the issue of relationship between minority and majority. The European Youth Capital 2015 was a 1-year-long intensive learning session for the current generation of youth leaders, in which they found out that the minority communities have to be seen as an added value to the local community. As a result, a real-life network between the majority and minority NGOs was created. A network based on common goals and interests, interpersonal connections, and multilingualism, while safeguarding the identity of each other. Let me speak finally about a large and very timely European success story in the protection of national and linguistic minorities, the Minority Safe Pack European Citizens Initiative. The instrument of the European Citizens Initiative was created through the Lisbon Treaty with the aim of empowering European citizens. It gives the opportunity to call on the European Commission to propose new laws. If such an initiative is supported by 1 million citizens from at least 7 member states with a given threshold, the European Commission has to look at the matter in concern and decide on what action to take. The Federal Union of European Nationalities and its strong partners, the Democratic Alliance, among others, initiated the Minority Safe Pack European Citizens Initiative in 2012. The initiative foresees the adoption of a set of measures, hopefully becoming legal acts, in the policy areas of regional and minority languages, culture and education, regional policy, participation, equality, media, and regional or state support. Initially, the European Commission rejected the registration of the initiative because it found that the proposal was manifestly falling outside the competence of the Commission. But the organizers brought a successful action before the Court of Justice of the European Union for the annulment of the Commission's decision. After the favorable decision of the court, the Minority Safe Pack initiative was registered, and the organizers had 1 year to collect 1 million supporting signatures as of 3rd of April 2017. The initiative was finally signed by 1.2 million European citizens. This is a huge success of minority communities in itself. The Minority Intergroup has always strongly supported the idea to create a coherent EU-wide national minority policy on the European political level for this citizens' initiative. We very much hope that the European Commission will hear our voice and finally take concrete action. Working in the field of the protection of traditional, national, and linguistic minorities on the European level, it's not really the field of large, visible success stories. However, coming from such a background makes one understand how important every minor step is. Giving visibility to these communities on the EU level is of utmost importance. And even if presentations delivered in Strasbourg or Brussels would not solve the problems of these communities, it becomes harder and harder to disregard them by the European decision makers. This is the aim of our work. Thank you for your attention.
Thank you very much for this fine presentation, Agota. We appreciate your time and all the insight that you brought to it. Our next presenter is Andrea Bocskor, PhD. She's a member of the European Parliament, Special Representative on issues relating to Transcarpathia, Ukraine. She was born and raised in Beregszás in Kárpátalja. Dr. Bocskor received her PhD in Cultural History in 2011. She is a candidate of Historical Sciences at the Institute of Sciences in Kiev. The title of her presentation is The Issues Facing Minorities in Ukraine with Special Reference to Transcarpathia. Welcome, Dr. Bocskor.
Thank you very much, Susan, for introduction and also for having invited me to this conference. It's an honor to speak on this issue and to be with you tonight. So let's start with some statistics and a really short historic background. As you all know, modern Ukraine became independent in 1991 following the adoption of the Act of Independence adopted by the Ukrainian government on 24th of August. The collapse of the Soviet Union raised completely new challenges for the post-Soviet countries, one of which was the approach towards nationalities living in the territory of the newly independent states. According to the 2001 census, which is the last and only official census, the total population of the country was 45.4 million, 78% of which constitute the Ukrainians. The main minority groups in Ukraine are the following: Russians, Belarusians, Moldovans, Crimean Tatars, Bulgarians, Romanians, Hungarians, Poles, Jews, Armenians, and the Roma people. So we can see that it is really a multi-ethnic country. 99% of Hungarians living in Ukraine are inhabitants of Subcarpathia or Transcarpathia, which is also a multi-ethnic region. 80.5% of the population constitute Ukrainians, 12.1% are Hungarians, and 7.4% of others, that is Ruthenians, Romanians, Russians, Czechs, Slovaks, Germans, and Roma people. During the 20th century, in the consequence of the two world wars, the population of Subcarpathia belonged to a number of states, which of course had positive and negative impacts on people and developed tolerance towards one another. You may have heard the old joke that the Subcarpathian elderly people, although never left their village, were happened to be citizens of 5 countries. And it is not just a joke, it is the reality of our life. The name of the region was also modified several times, and even now we use 2 options, that is Subcarpathia, Kárpátalja, and Transcarpathia, what means Zakarpattia or Kárpáton-túl. The first minority period of Subcarpathia started after the First World War in 1919, when it became part of Czechoslovakia. Then in 1938-39, it was returned to Hungary, and then in 1944, the territory was occupied by the Soviet army, and the most tough existence struggle and suffering started for the Hungarian community. In 1944, almost 30,000 Hungarian male population was deported from Malenki Robot to forced labor camps in the region, and majority of them never returned home. After the Second World War, the territory was officially annexed to the Soviet Union, to the Ukrainian Soviet Socialist Republic, and until its collapse, the Hungarians were treated collectively guilty with no rights to representation or any other political rights. But not just Hungarians, the Ukrainians and other nations had also limited rights and opportunities to express their will. In the period of political transformation in the 80s, an opportunity opened for the Subcarpathian Hungarians to make a step towards self-organization, and numerous cultural, political organizations and alliances were formed. For example, the Culture Alliance of Hungarians of Subcarpathia in 1989. Everyone was in favor of a new pluralistic democratic country. The hope of freedom arose as the last days of the Soviet communist regime came closer. The independence of Ukraine, although rooted in a national movement, was generally sympathetic to national minorities. In the first 10 years of independent Ukraine, the situation of minorities, despite of economic difficulties, was satisfactory. And the young Ukrainians tried to adopt the basic legislation on minorities. For example, in November 1991, the Ukrainian parliament adopted the Declaration on the Rights of Nationalities, guaranteeing all citizens equal political, economic, social, and cultural rights. Then, in 1992, the law about ethnic minorities in Ukraine was adopted, which is still the basic, besides the constitution of 1996, and also the international obligations which were ratified by Ukraine, that is the European Charter on Regional and Minority Languages, or the Council of Europe's Framework Convention on the Rights of Minorities. About the language and education. As we all know, language is the most important element of the national identity. Every national community tries to preserve its language because it is the main source of its existence. The linguistic rights of the minorities even more important because the native language is the only link between them with previous generations and the only tool to inherit their identity to future generations. That is why the issue of minority language education is so vital. So we will have to look into its historic aspects a little bit as well. Hungarian language education has long traditions in our regions. Schools with Hungarian as the language of instruction operated here even in, when this region belonged to Czechoslovakia or the Soviet Union. After 1991, independence of Ukraine opened up new possibilities for minority language education. The only problem was the supply of the new methodology for the teaching of the new state language, the Ukrainian. In 1990s, habits of peaceful coexistence, tolerance towards mother tongue languages, and the equal possibility of using Russian and the Ukrainian languages provided conflictless relations among nationalities. Under the 1990s of Ukraine, according to Article 53, national minorities are guaranteed the right to education in their mother tongue or to study in their mother tongue. So it's our basic right. The biggest achievement of the Hungarian community in that times was the establishment of the Transcarpathian Hungarian Teachers Training College in 1996, which later in 2003 was renamed to Második Rákóczi Ferenc Transcarpathian Hungarian Institute. It was the first and only accredited higher education institution with the Hungarian language of instruction. But we have to note that it is financially supported by Hungary and not the Ukrainian budgetary means. Unfortunately, the basic legislation on the use of languages and on education adopted since then gradually limits the rights guaranteed and divides different national minority groups to different categories of rights. That is, discriminates minorities in comparison to the majority population and amongst themselves as well. Taking a closer look at the status of the Hungarian language and its changes, we can see that the language policy is not constant in independent Ukraine. The 2012 language law brought a positive change. We usually tell that 2012 law on regional languages is the most tolerant language law, because it gave the status of regional language to minority languages in those regions where the population where the proportion of national minorities exceed 10% of the populations. So some regions and settlements adopted Hungarian, Moldovan, Romanian, and Russian as regional languages, but the Ukrainian remained the only official countrywide language. So after then, the State Language Act adopted in 2019 reduced the status of the Hungarian language in Transcarpathia, even compared to 1991. Over the last century, several state entities have allowed minority languages to be used as official languages at regional and local level. The 2019 Ukrainian State Language Act abolished these regional languages, the status of regional languages, so as the status of the Hungarian language. And our language cannot be used as an official language in the work of the county, district, or local governments, even in nearly 100% Hungarian populated settlements. According to the expert group of the Council of Europe, neither before the adoption of the law on education in 2017 and the law on the state language in 2019, Ukraine did not respect those commitments which the country accepted by the ratification of the European Charter of Regional and Minority Languages. And what is the education law I'm talking about? We have to see the 2017 law on education, which was adopted by the Ukraine September, and which contains its famous Article 7, which was introduced for analysis to the Venice Commission of Council of Europe. The adoption of this law, and especially of Article 7, was generally met by international outrage. The United Nations High Commissioner for Human Rights warned that strengthening the position of the Ukrainian language must not occur at the expense of the languages of national minorities, and called upon the Ukrainian government to enforce the rights of national minorities without discrimination. The Venice Commission, in its recommendations, stated that the appropriate solution would be to revise the controversial Article 7 using a more balanced and clearer normative text. The Commission believes that Ukraine should make it possible for minorities to learn their native language, not only as schools, but also to learn other subjects in that language, so that they can problem solve in their mother tongue. There was also reference on postponing the implementation of the language provisions of the law on education until 2023, and to make exemption for the private schools. As the result, Ukraine declared that it accepts the recommendations of the Venice Commission, but finally incorporated just some of them into law. That is the exemption and the postponement until 2023. So we have just a little time when it comes to force. Meanwhile, Kiev is also not respecting its own regulations and norms, because the government should have submitted a new draft law on minorities in January 2020, as it was stated in the law on the state language recommendations. The draft regulation is still not ready, so therefore the minority rights are in from this side as well. During the academic year 2019 and 20, nearly 16,000 children studied Hungarian in 97 schools, mostly with Hungarian as language of instruction in Transcarpathia. However, not all Hungarians are able to get education in their mother tongue. The higher the level of the education, the more Hungarian children and youngsters study in the official language. And most of them are forced to learn in Ukrainian or to choose the Ukrainian language education, just because there is no Hungarian kindergarten or no Hungarian language school available in their settlements or near the place of their residence. National minority schools can use their national language at the primary, but have to increase gradually the usage of the Ukrainian as the language of education in the secondary school, bringing it eventually to 100%. That means total transformation of minority schools, first to bilingual ones, and what is completely unacceptable for the Hungarian community, that until graduation, the school subjects should be transformed totally to 100% to Ukrainian language education. We consider that it is an attempt to forced assimilation, and we think that the solution could be to this whole problem, improving the methodology of teaching of the Ukrainian language in minority schools and not suppressing the minority languages. Unfortunately, we also have to state that now, in last few weeks, constant attacks were made against the Hungarian, the representatives and organizations of Hungarians and minorities. And some of the violent actions against the Hungarians are pure provocations that should be prevented, investigated, and charged by the authorities, and the security of the citizens should be granted. Unfortunately, we have to state that besides the restrictions of our rights by the means of parliamentary law changes, we have to face some intimidations and threats from the side of Ukrainian nationalists who often attack the Hungarian community, for example, by holding intimidating marches in the region, posting provocating video messages on different websites, enlisting individuals belonging to the Hungarian minority as the enemies of the country on the Mirotvorec website. And unfortunately, we had to also to face when in February 2018, a bomb attack was carried out against the central headquarters of the Cultural Alliance of Hungarians in Subcarpathia in the city of Uzhhorod. On the other hand, the authorities also make political pressure and on the political leaders of the Hungarian community, for example, by the actions of the security service of Ukraine, as it happened a few weeks ago, what is unacceptable and unprecedented. And you may be aware that on 30th of November, coordinated law enforcement actions were taken against the Hungarian organizations and its leader, and when dozens of armed commandos of the State Security Service occupied the apartment of László Branzovic, the president of the Cultural Alliance of Hungarians, and also the offices of charity foundations of Agota-Dorottya and a charity foundation for the Transcarpathian Hungarian Rákóczi Ferenc Institute. And these actions against these organizations were done with the purpose of house searchings, and the search warrant for these searchings were issued in Zaporizhia, what is thousands kilometers far from Transcarpathia, and it is based on fabricated political accusations of treason. Such actions make the activities of Hungarian organizations impossible and also intimidate the Hungarians living in Ukraine and their leaders. And it was done, I have to say, unfortunately, in the midst of the coalition negotiations to the County Council of Transcarpathia. So it is a very bad precedent now what is going on, and it should be prevented by the Ukrainian authorities and also by the international community. Coming back to the educational rights and educational issues, unfortunately, we are experiencing now very tough times, and still the Hungarians of Transcarpathia stand by the maintenance of the Hungarian institutional network from kindergarten to universities. We believe that not the language of education should be radically transformed, but the methodology of teaching of the state language. And there is a need for education in Hungarian language because the community will live if the Hungarian language education will be available for Hungarian children in Transcarpathia. In my opinion, Ukraine should not limit the already existed rights and have to respect its minorities. It should develop and implement policies related to national minorities that will provide an opportunity for free use of native language in public, in education, in media. And this would be the right way of maintaining peaceful coexistence of different nationalities, cultures, and people. Hungarians want to be equal partners in designing the laws concerning the minority issues and want to be heard. Many good examples are provided by the member states of the European Union, Ukraine willing to join too. So the EU and the international community have to mediate in bringing back Ukraine to the atmosphere of tolerance towards minorities. Because I believe that we can do it, and we will get back on the right track. And the Hungarian community in Transcarpathia will also have good opportunities to exist and to develop their culture and language. Thank you for the attention.
Thank you very much, Dr. Bocskor, especially for your comprehensive presentation regarding the very sad news coming out of Ukraine lately, and your optimistic view that these can possibly be changed, that you believe that, and you are working towards the aim of changing this incredibly difficult situation. Thank you for all your hard work and your presentation. Our Katalin Kálmán Hajdók, she was born in Prague. She was 9 years old when the independent Slovak Republic was established in 1993, and she experienced firsthand the significant changes in her social environment. Mrs. Kalman Hajdók received her master's degree in economics and management from the Agricultural University in Nitra, Slovakia. Presently, she's on maternity leave with her daughter. Her most recent position was with IBM Slovakia as education manager, focused on talent development and cross-team collaboration. The title of her presentation is The Process of Assimilation and the Identity of the Hungarian Minority in Slovakia. Welcome.
Thank you. Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. Allow me to share with you a personal event, or rather impression, that has followed me since my childhood. This event was closely tied to the awareness when I realized that I was a slightly different Hungarian. I was not able to comprehend why I was living in Czechoslovakia but spoke Hungarian, and why, after a wait of many hours at the border, my parents said, "No, we are in Hungary." I didn't need to go to Hungary to be at home. A further puzzle was the incomprehension I faced in some places in Slovakia when I asked for an ice cream in Hungarian. For me, it was perfectly natural. I did not speak another language. That was the language I learned from my mother, the one I used every day, the one I sang in, the one I used while playing. I was a child. With the passage of time, I became less concerned with providing answers for the many questions. I became used to the state of affairs, and it became normal. Looking back, I can say that it was then that my sense of identity was established, and I became aware that I'm different Hungarian and live elsewhere. However, I'm no less for all that. I suppose, like me, everybody has their own story. This analogy came to my mind when I tried to find an answer to the question, why are the number of Hungarians in Slovakia steadily declining? What happens to these? What happens to the disappearing sons, daughters, grandchildren, great-grandchildren of Hungarian forefathers? Or are they still here, only it is not worth it for them to be Hungarian, to stay Hungarian in Slovakia? We do not know what the next census will disclose. However, let's be honest, it's feared that once again there will be fewer of us. All of us who live here would like to know the reason, and more importantly, we would like to know the solution. It would be worthwhile to consider some of the burning issues, aside from assimilation, that must be addressed. Some fundamental problems are: if we look at the southern belt of Slovakia, the region with a majority ethnic Hungarian population, the population growth is visibly lagging. The reason is difficult to ascertain, all the more as the demographic tendencies reflect those everywhere in East Central Europe. A further negative impact might be that this region has a higher rate of unemployment than overall. The lack of motivation and enthusiasm rules everyday life. Infrastructure is well below the national average, primarily in the physical sense, which contributes greatly to lower investments in the region. The existing infrastructure does not meet the economic needs. Although migration and emigration was always present in a living and viable society, today it has assumed such proportions as to endanger our continued existence. There is something wrong in a society where fathers, and in many cases mothers, are compelled in the hope of getting work to be separated from their families by hundreds of kilometers. The residents of villages are aging and are being depopulated. We simply have to look at the towns and the villages of Gömör County. Circumstances force the Hungarians living here to make decisions which can have unforeseen results. I think the time has come to recognize that the roots of the problems might be identified and fixed rather than addressing the consequences of these issues. Many of the Hungarian towns and villages are unable to keep pace with developments. This can be especially dangerous. If time stands still for us, perhaps we shall never be able to close the gap with the more rapidly developing regions. There will be nothing on offer for young families, which in this day and age contributes to a feeling of belonging more to a different environment than to their own homeland. To quote the great writer Tamási Áron, he who changes their homeland should change his heart. Thus, it's absolutely necessary that the Hungarian minority be strengthened at the local level. We must start to build the foundations if we want to produce results. A possible remedy may be various social programs aimed at young families, programs whose main goal is to reduce passivity and increase active participation. Among others, organizing various local events such as balls, creative workshops, dances, summer camps, wine tastings, programs to beautify the village's surroundings through community effort. These all reinforce the importance of taking part in community activities. From an economic point of view, it would be worthwhile to think of encouraging or increasing village or farm tourism, tied in with the creation of village heritage museums, the protection of architectural monuments, and the expansion of various local characteristics, folk customs, and traditions. The borders opened up in 2004, and we officially became part of the European Union. The dream of many became a reality. We believed that perhaps things would be easier in this new country, that we have someone to count on, someone who will solve all problems. But somehow nobody seems to be volunteering for this task. We must realize that no one will do our job for us. Not Hungary, not the European Union. Being a member of the EU is not only a state, but also a huge challenge. We must learn to recognize its advantages and make it work for us. Naturally, not just the economic advantages, but also the cultural, social, and educational advantages. A minority is a living entity, just like society at large, whose future is influenced to a great degree by such factors as the free flow of labor, education, regional politics and culture, and a multi-tiered nation. Here I'm thinking of mixed marriages. These exert such a strong influence that it is almost impossible to avoid the results we see. The problem of assimilation still awaits solution. Another very important issue is the safeguarding of education in the mother tongue. The open borders today satisfy the young people's freedom of movement. With the opening of the borders came a growth of opportunities. However, for a minority, it is at the utmost importance that trained young people are coming back and applying their knowledge at home. We should strive to train a generation who are proud of their heritage without extremism and who are not afraid to be exacting of themselves and others. That is the only way we can move forward. The very first step is to strengthen the family unit, to convince Hungarian parents that a child will not be put at a disadvantage if sent to a Hungarian language school. Learning more than one language is not a handicap, nor other areas of life. It is necessary for us to understand, for a healthy sense of identity to develop, education in the mother tongue is indispensable. Children should not be robbed of the joy of carefree play in the mother tongue or from the sense of belonging. The second necessary step is teacher training. The need is for teachers who are able to perform in an international sphere, serving as an example to their students, able to encourage learning, to push for taking part in trans-border and international initiatives. We need educators actively seeking challenges and open to opportunities. Ones who not only are engaged, but who initiate unique challenges with their ideas. They should find opportunities for cooperation with other schools, open dialogues for cooperation with the local governments, local cultural centers, foundations. Another interesting possibility lies in high schools and the possible collaboration between the high schools and universities. With various types of recruitment and open houses, those interested can get an insight into further education, hopefully to become part of it. Active recruitment would aid orientation, which would support making the right choices. The community must be supported. That in itself supports and strengthens the sense of belonging. These are cultural and linguistic islands without which not one minority can exist. In the end, it is good and necessary to belong somewhere. Perhaps that is the key idea, to feel and make us feel that we belong somewhere, to feel that everybody counts, individually, separately, from east to west. It is fitting to close my remarks with the words of Göncz Árpád. Wherever a person might live, wherever fate takes him, he must always belong somewhere where he is loved, from where he gains strength, has the opportunity for responsible action. We must believe that our fate is in our own hands, that we can help each other, that we can change the world. That belief is what holds us together. Thank you for your attention.
Thank you very much, Katalin, Kálmán, Hajdók. We really appreciate the presentation on the present situation in Slovakia for the Hungarian minority. Our next presenter is Renáta Laczi, who was born and raised in Bácska-Topolya, Vojvodina, Serbia. She earned a bachelor's degree in international relations in Hungary, a master's degree in international and business and economics in Italy, and a PhD in advanced economics and management technology in Italy. Dr. Laczi speaks 5 languages. The title of her presentation is Growing Up in Vojvodina, Multiculturalism and the Experience of Marginalization. Welcome, Dr. Laczi.
Thank you very much for the introduction. Greetings to everybody. I would like to talk today about my Trianon experience from a very personal point of view, because I think that the most powerful instrument to transmit what does it really mean to grow up in a Hungarian ethnic minority in a region that used to belong to Hungary not so much time ago. And what does it mean being a subject of marginalization for one's origins can be transmitted through these personal experiences. So while preparing for my presentation, I was trying to find a corresponding personal memory to the events of the last 28 years in the region of Vojvodina, and to represent how certain decisions that are most often independent from us, how these can have a significant impact on our life and on our personality. I was born in 1992 in Bácska-Topolya, Vojvodina. At that time, the official name of the country was Yugoslavia. Then from 2003 to 2006, it became Serbia and declared its independence its name changed to the Republic of Serbia. So by staying at the same point, I changed at least 3 countries in a very young age. However, before the Treaty of Trianon in 1980, the territory of Vojvodina belonged to the Hungarian kingdom, and also in the period between the 2 world wars. And the territory of Vojvodina is a very special place. I was born in the city of Bačka Topola, which is a town with around 50,000 inhabitants, where 50% of the population was Hungarian at the time. And the largest ethnic minority, amongst others, was Hungarian. But there were also Slovaks, German Slavs, Ruthenians, and other smaller minorities living together with the Serbian national community. The 1990s, however, was a period full of conflicts in Yugoslavia. In such a hostile situation, there was a lot of tension arising. First, there was the war in 1991, which was the culmination of the Croatian and Serbian. And then in 1999, when I was only 7 years old, our life has changed again from one day to the other. I remember it was 8 o'clock in the evening, and my parents were watching TV in the living room, and I was playing around, when all of a sudden, a headline appeared on the screen. It was saying, the NATO had started an air raid against Kosovo. So at that moment, when the transmission was interrupted by the breaking news, I was told by my parents to grab a toy and a book from my room, and we will all go to my grandparents' house, because our home was located very close to a military station, and my parents were afraid that it can easily become a target for the bombs. So for the time being, we transferred to the house of my grandparents, and as you can imagine, we were there in 10 in a very small house, so it was not very sustainable, and soon we decided that even though it can be dangerous, we go back to our home. And I remember the nights when my parents were rushing to my room, and they were afraid that I could be woken up by the reverberation of the bombs that were falling during the night. Kilometers from our house, which means only around 25 miles away. But by the way, it was around 420 miles away from Kosovo. In that period of war, I learned to play cards, and since we often had no electricity, we were frequently playing by the candlelight. And during the summer, I was playing outside in our garden because I was not allowed to go anywhere else. And moreover, when I heard the sound of the sirens, I knew that I had to go back inside. And I heard also the fighter jets breaking the sound barriers, which was a terrible noise. Then in September, the same year, I started the first year of the elementary school. The war was over, and my parents took me for the shopping for the beginning of the school. So they brought me to take the school bag, the notebooks, and everything that was necessary for starting the elementary school. And we went to the capital of Vojvodina, that is the city of Novi Sad. And after collecting all these items, we went to take a walk along the Danube River, where there was nothing else but the pillars of these enormous bridges broken into pieces and that were still floating there in the water. And all the buildings around had their windows broken as they were shattered by the explosion of the bombs. And these are images that I saw when I was 7 years old, and that burnt into my mind forever. And probably I couldn't even understand completely the tragedy of the war at that moment. But today I know that I have lived through an unforgettable experience that many other people from my age cannot even imagine. As I said, Vojvodina is a special place. I have a strange memory from the period when I was a teenager and I started to become aware of the complex. What does it mean? A nationality, living in a minority, experiencing marginalization. And I remember learning in a geography class in high school where, by the way, I had a Serbian teacher who spoke perfect Hungarian. And I think she was quite the exception by the time. So I learned that Vojvodina is a place where 25 different ethnic minorities represent the 1/3 of the population. And as such a territory, it's among the few places of the world where it is possible. And I remember that I felt it's very, very special about it, and being amazed by this fact. And I always enjoyed being surrounded by people from different nationalities with different cultures, habits, and languages. And I grew up into this multicultural society, and I think I can call myself lucky in this sense, because I attended a bilingual kindergarten where we learned one song in Hungarian and one in Serbian. I learned to count to 10 in both languages at the same time. I had friends and neighbors with different nationalities. And as a child, it all seemed very normal. It was all very colorful. Of course, at home, we spoke Hungarian, and we followed Hungarian and the Christian traditions as we were a Hungarian family. However, my parents encouraged me not to be afraid to speak in Serbian. And when I had a Serbian person in front of me, also for me, it was very normal to do so because I knew their language. However, now, as an adult, I can understand that my parents' reason behind all this was that they were trying to protect me. Because feeling special was only one side of the coin. Growing up in a Vojvodina, in a community where you belong to a minority, it's inevitable to experience the feeling of being marginalized as well. The feeling that you can't get a job, be in a school competition, even if you are the most talented one, or simply being taken into consideration just because you are a Hungarian. And in those moments, you feel very angry and disappointed and helpless because you were discriminated for something you can't change and you don't even want to actually, and something that is not really depending on you. And then all the magic that you felt before seems to disappear. And I remember one of my first experiences. It was in 2008 when Kosovo declared its independence, and there were a lot of protests on the streets. And we were sent home from school because it was not safe to stay there anymore. And the protests were going on for days. And at one point, the protesters were throwing bricks on the building of the high school because it was known as a high school for only Hungarian students. At the very same afternoon, my friends got beaten up on the streets because they were speaking Hungarian among each other. And I remember the feeling that I couldn't make sense to all this in my head. Why is it happening to us, even if we are not part of the conflict? So why are they also against the Hungarians? And I think in these very moments, it's very important to stay open-minded and try to look for the opportunities, because you have to study and work twice as much and twice as hard to achieve your goals in such an environment. However, working and studying hard is something that nobody can take away from you. So I also took my baggage, my belonging to a Hungarian minority, and started. It was around the time when I was 18, and I had to decide to which university to apply to. I had the opportunity to participate in the Students Without Boundaries program organized by the Rákóczi Foundation, where I met a lot of brilliant people with whom I could discuss about my experiences of living in a minority and to help me to expand my horizons. For this reason, I decided to study international relations because I really wanted to understand what kind of rights belong to the minorities and what can be done to protect and advocate for these rights. And also what kind of politics and interests can lead to such a situation like we found ourselves after Trianon. So I continued with my studies in Hungary. And living in Hungary was an amazing experience. Also from the point of view that everybody was speaking Hungarian. You didn't have anymore the anxiety if you went to a shop and you had to decide in which language the sellers, because before that in Vojvodina, or you decided to read them in Serbian or in Hungarian or maybe on both, but you never knew what can be the reaction. And in Hungary, it was all very normal to use your mother tongue. And it was very simple and normal living in Hungary. But also in this case, there was another side of the story, because as much as it might sound strange, I felt also a kind of a marginalization while living in Hungary, because I was actually coming from Serbia. I was still Hungarian, but different. And I belonged to two countries and to neither of them at the same time. I remember the numerous compliments I received for speaking a correct Hungarian without any accent, or how many times I was called a Serb. And with time, I learned how to handle these situations, but I found them very offensive because I felt just as much Hungarian as they were. And I read the great classics of the Hungarian literature. I know the history of Hungary by heart. I think that Budapest is the most beautiful city in the world. Seemed to be not enough. And once again, I had to work twice as much and twice as hard to be accepted. Then in 2012, I had the opportunity to obtain the Hungarian citizenship, thanks to the birth certificate of my grandmother that proved my origins. And obviously, I didn't even hesitate about it, because I thought that this is something that belongs to me. When I was collecting the necessary documents, I found out that my great-grandfather had a slightly different surname in Hungarian. As you can see, my name now is spelled as Laczi, just like his was in 1901 when he was born. But after the Treaty of Trianon, it has been changed to Laci, as it was the phonetic transcription of his surname in Serbian. And this is how I found it in the birth certificate later on of my grandfather and also of my father, who didn't even knew about this fact. And when I submitted the documentation at the Hungarian consulate, the officer asked me if I wanted to change my name back to what it used to be. And I was very surprised at that moment. I had to decide on spot, so I had no much time for thinking. But I was quite convinced to answer yes. So I decided to use my surname as it was used by my great-grandfather before the Treaty of Trianon. And I think it was very nice to decide and not just being a subject of something happening to you. It was needless to say that I had to change all my personal documents, ID cards, passports, and so on. In the public offices, I encountered the very same trouble with the transcription of my surname, especially in Cyrillic. So you could say that nothing has changed in the last 100 years. It's not completely true, because this time I had the opportunity to talk to a lawyer who put together a document with the most important details of this story, and it served as an evidence that I am the very same person, but my surname is written now in Hungarian. And as you can see now, I can use my surname this way, and I am very proud of it. Then in 2015, I arrived to program, and suddenly I could be the Hungarian without any labels. And as I found myself in an international community. And perhaps this is the reason why the international communities have always attracted me. One of the most frequently asked questions, and a very simple question when you meet somebody, is where are you from? However, I was always afraid of this question, because for me it was a point of difficulty. And this time, thanks to the English and the Italian language structure, I could simply answer, I am a Hungarian. I didn't need any explanations. And I didn't need also any geographic tags that I am a Hungarian from Vojvodina. But after a time being, I realized how little people know about what happened in the period after the First World War. And those concepts that we history class, such as the Treaty of Trianon, they cannot even imagine what does it mean for real. So I started another personal mission here, and I decided to go for the complicated answer. If I am asked, where are you from? I answer, I was born and raised in Serbia, but I am a Hungarian. And I already know that it will not be clear how is it possible for most of the people I meet. And then I start to explain with more or less details, depending on the situation, about the Austrian-Hungarian Empire, the Kingdom of Hungary, the First World War, the Treaty of Trianon, and outcomes. And at this point, somebody becomes curious and makes me further questions because they want to know more, or they simply remain impressed. In Italy, it is happening to me frequently. They try to find a comparison to understand what does it mean being from a different nationality and living in the territory of another country. And they find the paragon, the example of the city of Trieste. But sometimes people are not saying anything about it. Very fine, because I am not expecting empathy or anybody to feel sorry for me or anything like that. The point is that I can talk proudly about my origins and take responsibility of speaking about it. My aim is to raise attention. And unfortunately, like many other young and talented people, I have left Vojvodina. I'm really appreciating the work of those people who remain there and they're trying to do something for the Hungarian community. My life took different turns. I always dreamt to do something else, to push my limits. I wanted to study, I wanted to travel, I wanted to become successful, and I needed a space where I am not judged because of my background. And also life happened to me. So my parents left the country. I fell in love in Italy. I have no more close relatives in Vojvodina. So it was never really a question if I would go back or not. But with time, I understood even better how important it is to preserve my language and my culture. And I continue reading in Hungarian. I read the news, I read the books. I had the opportunity to watch Hungarian theater performances, which was very much missing from my life. And I think that the language and the culture are just as much part of my personality as all the experiences that I learned growing up in a multicultural environment and living as a minority. As a consequence, I also read the news about Serbia and Vojvodina, of course, because this will always be part of me. My only wish right now is to find a way to do something for the Hungarian minorities, even from the distance. And thanks to the Students Without Boundaries program, I have the chance to talk to hundreds of young people coming from minority backgrounds. And I always try to encourage them to get over the feeling of being marginalized and, on the contrary, take an advantage of those experiences and to work hard towards their dreams. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. And I would like to wrap up this panel discussion and thanking all our presenters for their firsthand accounts, very interesting, very insightful firsthand accounts of their lives, of their communities, in particular the Hungarian community in Romania, Ukraine, Slovakia, and Serbia. You have all demonstrated a deep concern for the human rights situation in your homelands, and we thank you for provided so much insight into these regions. And I'm sure that all the people who will be watching this in the future will be much appreciative of your efforts and of your time and energy. Thank you so much. And további jó munkát kívánunk. All the best. Thank you.